let's talk about protests. So there are protests going on in, oh boy, you know what? I will not even attempt to.
pronouncenames.com.
Bashkortostan.
Yeah, no, okay. Bashkortostan, okay? That's as close as I'm gonna get. Very sorry. Takes a while to learn a language. Anyway, protests are breaking out there. And they're breaking out there after there was the arrest of a local activist. He's been put in jail for 4 years, and the Russian government was not expecting the reaction it got, which is people are not happy. So people are not happy, but when I say people are not happy, I mean people are really not happy. Let's see if we can watch this. Yep, here it is. Here are clashes with local police. We hear that they're also or possibly going to be sending in some National Guard as well. We don't know for sure. As right now, it's still just rumor. Fali Alsyanov was accused of using racist language. He said his words were mistranslated from his Bashkir language. A huge thank you for all of those who came out to support me. I will never forget this. I do not plead guilty. I have always been struggling for justice, for my people, for my republic. So God willing, we will see each other again. That right here, this is an internal pressure that is probably terrifying the Kremlin. And that's not to say this specifically is going to bring down the regime. But the war in Ukraine has terribly strained Russia's resources. Much of Russia that used to be covered by air defense systems are having air defense systems brought back and leaving parts of Russia more vulnerable for attack with missiles or any sort of airborne attack in order to try to sustain the air defense systems in Ukraine, which keep getting blown up by the Ukrainians using drones, artillery, missiles. You get the idea. They are sending more and more conscripts, more and more contract soldiers, anybody they can get their hands on, including foreign mercenaries, even to the point where nation states like Nepal are like closing down like immigration over to Russia to stop their recruitment of their people. They're getting as many soldiers as they can to throw in there. 97% of their pre-war force has been destroyed. The force that they sent into Ukraine lost tons and tons of tanks, tons and tons of munitions. It's been a very brutal war for the Russians. And they are spending all of the resources they can to try to sustain it. But if they are focusing all their energy in Ukraine, all the troops, all the replacements, even to the point where they're sending troops with like just a few weeks of training to the front line to hold positions and getting them killed. That seems to indicate that another security crisis for the Russians right now would be a terrible time. Russia is the largest country on earth. Keeping Russia interconnected through its railway systems, through its airplanes, through infrastructure is unbelievably important. That interconnectedness, when you're trying to unite such sparse and divided land, has been the challenge that every Russian leader has faced. And Putin is no different. That's why the Ukrainians have been trying to target rail lines and working with local partisans to try to target rail lines all across Russia to strain their logistics, to make it so that the Russian rail system, the Russian logistics system is strained and hurt, so they can't use the full force of their power, the full force of the Russian people, the full force of the Russian army. Because you can have like 1,000 troops on the front, but if they only got 10 bullets, they can't do anything. At least that's the idea. But with all their resources focused on Ukraine and the Ukrainians looking for anywhere at home where they could cause disruption in order to try to divert resources away. This is the same reason why probably there were those plans that were leaked that the Ukrainians were thinking of working with the FSA in Idlib to fight the Syrian and Russian governments there, so the Russian government have to divert more troops there. So this could be a real security crisis that the Ukrainians are looking to take advantage of. And if there is a security crisis where a big rebellion happens in one of Russia's provinces, do the Russians have the troops to deal with it? We saw what happened during the Wagner March on Moscow. They were digging holes in the road trying to slow them down. They didn't have the forces ready to confront them, and the forces weren't willing to confront them. And so that has to be quite concerning. And the Russians have been scrambling to try to get something to be able to defend their flanks. They've been empowering the National Guard. They gave a lot of the armor that used to belong to Wagner over to the National Guard. The National Guard has been a huge benefactor of the Wagner coup. And the reason why is they know that on the home front, if a second security crisis was to happen, it's difficult enough for Russia to sustain its war in Ukraine. Another security crisis would be that much more difficult. And it would remove pressure from the Ukrainians. And so when you start seeing protests like this is how people start thinking. This is how the Kremlin starts thinking. This is how Kiev starts thinking. That's how other people start thinking. And so if there's enough discontent amongst the public to start a security crisis because of increases to the cost of living, or because of increases to, rent, or decreases in the quality of infrastructure, or increased repression out of fear of something like this happening, there could be some blowback. All I want to say about this is that you can only push a population so far. And so the Russian government is going to try to find ways whatever way they can to try to soothe the situation, to make it so this type of a threat doesn't come about. Because they can only deal with the one security crisis they got. They don't want to be provoking anymore. So the question is, can the Russians govern the state, including the areas of the country that are way far from Moscow, that are divided from Moscow by miles and miles and miles of rail and road and air travel? Can they keep them united even as the cost of living increases and the war strains them more as they send more of the young men to die for a war that isn't directly benefiting them outside of course, the prices paid to those of the dead out of compensation? So I'm interested to see if this escalating cost of living is going to further worsen the relationship they have with many of the republics, definitely republics in the East, and if that could create a security crisis. I know the Russians are worried about that. I know the Ukrainians have thought about that. And I know that there are almost certainly activists throughout the Russian Far East that are thinking about that themselves. We're not at that point. Right now, this is just a protest, but I'm just giving you the dynamic at which the Russian government is looking at these protests, because they're very worried about these protests spiraling out of control. And people could say, oh, it's just a protest, but Euromaidan also started as a protest. Keep that in mind. Well, let's keep going, boys. So I wanted to talk about this Medvedev post. So for those of you who don't know, Medvedev is the former president of Russia, and he's currently on the Russian Security Council. I think he's the head of the Russian Security Council, actually. He kind of is known for putting out crazy statements about the war. People call them Medvedev's drunken rants. But he is still the former president of Russia. He has been with Putin since the campaign trail, back since like 1999. So he's one of like Putin's most long-standing allies, still in his inner circle from the campaign days. And many people, when they talk about who comes to rule Russia after Putin, Medvedev is one of the few names that are floated, even if still it's impossible to imagine anyone in his inner circle taking his place right now. He is one of the people that are floated since he was president in absence of Putin for a few years. Anyway, he has made a post, and whether or not it was vodka induced or not, it can still have an impact on the Russian public and how Russian soldiers behave. If they know that their former presidents and their presidents can speak this way, well, if it's good enough for the president or former president and Putin's allies, maybe it's good enough for them. Even if some Russia watchers speculate that him saying saying far out there stuff is part of him trying to make himself look like less of a threat to Putin, it can still have an effect. Here's what he wrote here. Why Ukraine is dangerous for its inhabitants. The existence of Ukraine is mortally dangerous for Ukrainians. And I don't mean only the current state, Bandera's political regime. I'm talking about any, absolutely any Ukraine. saying that any form of Ukrainian nationhood, any form of Ukraine existing, is dangerous for Ukrainians. Why? The presence of an independent state on historical Russian territories will now be a constant reason for resumption of hostilities. Now, if you take this to its logical conclusion, this would not only apply to Ukraine, this would also apply to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Kazakhstan, multiple countries in the Caucasus. Dude, this would apply to so many different countries. If this is the standard, like, oh, Russia used to be here once when it was an empire, well, then it has to be part of Russia forever. I'm sure the French said something similar to this when they were fighting in Algeria for a decade. Where were? Oh, no matter who is at the helm of the cancerous growth. That's some not great. Under the name of Ukraine, this will not add legitimacy to his rule and the legal viability of the country, in air quotes, itself. And therefore, the likelihood of a new fight will persist indefinitely, almost always. Moreover, this is a 100% probability of a new conflict, no matter what security papers the West signs with the puppet Kiev regime. Neither Ukraine's association with the EU, nor even the entry of the artificial country into NATO will prevent it. This could happen in 10 or 50 years. This is why by the way, this is all aligns perfectly with the artificialness of all of these post-Soviet states, aligns perfectly with the Russian imperial idea that is being pushed everywhere. And we did a video about it recently about Russia's borders ending nowhere, which is as close as you can get to the ideological underpinnings of empire, the idea that your borders end nowhere. Then there's no stronger ideological underpinning to empire. If your line officially is our borders end nowhere, these two things align perfectly. And that Russia's borders end nowhere is the party line. That is why the existence of Ukraine is fatal for Ukrainians. They are practical people at the end of the day, no matter how now they wish the Russians to die. No matter how much they hate the Russian leadership, no matter how much they strive to join the mythical European Union and NATO, choosing between eternal war and inevitable death in life, the vast majority of Ukrainians, well, perhaps with the exception of a minimal number of frostbitten nationalists, will ultimately choose life. They will understand that life in a large common state, which they do not like very much now, is better than death. Their deaths and the deaths of their loved ones. And the sooner Ukrainians realize this, the better. So this is a declaration of a few things. It's a declaration of that Ukraine's existence is dangerous for its people. And that the reason why it's dangerous for its people is that as long as Ukraine exists, the Russians will kill Ukrainians. As long as the country exists, the people will die and suffer because the Russians cannot allow this part of Russia, in their view, to ever be away from it, since it's artificial. Now, you could use this logic to invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Romania, Georgia, all sorts of countries, Azerbaijan. You could invade tons of countries with this logic. So this logic is poison. This only ends badly, because if this is taken to its logical conclusion, it will not end with Ukraine, and it will not end with a ceasefire, and it could end with an invasion of other countries if this is taken to its logical conclusion. So that's terrifying. But it also seems to openly state that either the Ukrainians exist as subjects of the Russian Empire, or the Ukrainians are not allowed to exist at all, and no matter what they do, no matter what they say, no matter what they sign, no matter what groups they join, the Russians will always come back, and they will always crush them and kill them until they make the practical decision to give in and be Russian, no matter how much they don't like it. This continues the line of Russia's borders ending nowhere, of its claims to empire. This continues the line of all post-Soviet states being artificial and Russia having basically dominion over them since they're the regional hegemon, and that they have a right to do anything they want to them. This type of hubris has been the fall of many empires, but more importantly, it has been the start of much suffering. And this is not hubris we should entertain. This is hubris we should stuff out. And we can do that by supporting the Ukrainians and showing the Russian public what this pathway will lead to inevitably. And that is them having someone else raise their sons and daughters. And so that path is best avoided, and it's best avoided as soon as possible. The sooner the Russians leave, the better. The last thing we want to do is encourage and foster this poison. By the way, it's not like it's only with Medvedev. Confident Putin boasts of Russian conquests in Ukraine. With the invasion now fast approaching the 2-year mark, the Russian dictator apparently no longer feels the need to dress up his true intentions. Buoyed by a very visible recent weakening in Western resolve, Putin is now openly embracing the language of imperialism and is referring to Russian conquests in Ukraine. Now, I know this is the Atlantic Council, but not a lot of mainstream media is covering this. It's the only reason I used it. Here's DW talking about the same story. Conquests. Conquest. He speaks in the language of empire. They put up posters with Russia's borders end nowhere. When they conquer area, they put up posters saying Russia will never leave. All post-Soviet states that used to be part of Russia's empire post to the Soviet Union are artificial. This is all the language in the ideological underpinnings of empire building. Empire building. This is not something we should allow to foster. This is not something we should entertain or play cute with. This is something we should do away with as soon as possible. Make it as clear as possible that this pathway will lead nothing but to Russia's destruction by its own undoing, by falling off on spear after spear and sword after sword by invading these countries.